I'm your host, Kareem Irfan, for this new talk show, which we are pleased to be launching on Muslim Network TV, a newly established television network aimed at Muslim and other audiences, aiming to educate and empower the Muslim American community and represent it to broader society. Muslim Network TV broadcasts to the US, Canada, and Mexico. Our show, Understanding Today, will be live streaming on social media and YouTube. You can watch us via Galaxy 19 satellite, Amazon Fire TV, Roku TV, and soon on Apple TV. Friends, my intention is to cover interesting, cutting-edge topics of current relevance. A range of arenas will be addressed over coming episodes: social, economic, legal, high-tech, business management, strategy, leadership, activism. And I'd love to hear from you, your comments, your suggestions on episode topics and guests that you wish to see. For our launching episode, we have focused on a topic which is of current and direct relevance. The Black Lives Movement has showcased America's racial divide like never before. Policing violence has come under the microscope. Calls for defunding, disbanding of the police, radical changes in leadership are rampant. What we need to do is understand what is happening, and that is the crux of our discussion today, focusing on collaborative policing in a divided society. So as we get on with it, you will be pleased to hear from one of the most recognized, most active experts in this field around the country. We are privileged to have with us Mr. David Dial, Chief David, as I would like to call him. He's currently the Director of Criminal Justice at Aurora University. And he's got an illustrative background with about 6 decades of committed work in the policing arena, and most of it in visionary activities in collaborative, community-oriented policing. He started out with service on the Lakewood, Colorado Police Department. He ended up as the assistant police chief there before he signed on to the Naperville, Illinois Police Department as their chief after a nationwide search. And he ended up serving there for 22 years, building upon his past service of 17 years at the Lakewood Department. In terms of his education, he's got his Master of Public Administration from the University of Colorado. He's got his Master's of Homeland Security and Defense degree from the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School. And he backs it up with some serious leadership responsibilities. He's a past president of the DuPage Chiefs of Police Association, the past chair of the DuPage Metropolitan Enforcement Group, board member of the Illinois Terrorism Task Force, and he currently serves on the Suburban Law Enforcement Homeland Security Advisory Council in DuPage County. So he's got his academic credentials, he's got his on-the-ground credentials, he's got his leadership credentials, and I am privileged and pleased and honored to have on our inaugural show the wonderful Chief Dial. Chief Dial, welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Kareem. It's great to be here and great to see you. I haven't seen you in a while, and it's good to be with you again, even if we're separated. It's great.
Hey, we are practicing our best in terms of social distancing, COVID precautions. And if need be, I'm sure both of us would put on masks too, right?
Yeah, we certainly would. I would be a mask wearer, but right now it's great to be here. I heard you say parts of 6 decades, and it made me sound very old.
A young 6 decades of experience. David, we've got a lot to be talking about.
Okay.
But what I wanted to do was start off with a focus on your getting into the police force, first of all. Because one thing I've learned in all of my research, my engagement, and I've been doing this with you and others for the last 30 decades, there is a cultural aspect to what we are talking about. What do people get into the police department for? What are the values that drive them initially? So take us back to say somebody of your caliber, so recognized, so much appreciated in terms of focusing on how to serve the community. Why did you get into policing, first of all, and build upon that, please?
It started when I grew up in California and did my undergraduate work at San Jose State. And while I was there, I knew that I wanted to be a part of something bigger than me and make a difference in my life and in the community. And I became interested in law enforcement. And during my senior year of college at San Jose State, I became a police officer. And I quite frankly loved every aspect of it. I had a great time. Shortly within my first year as a police officer, I had to take a military leave of absence. I was an Army ROTC in college, was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Military Intelligence Corps, and spent 1 year in military intelligence schools and Vietnamese Language Institute, and then 1 year as a military intelligence officer in Vietnam. I came right back to work after getting out of the Army, after my military service, got married and went back to work. And then in '73, moved to the Lakewood, Colorado Police Department. And then I was back to school again to get my first graduate degree, a Master of Public Administration from the University of Colorado. And it was there that I rose through the ranks from police agent, sergeant, lieutenant, captain, and ultimately the assistant police chief in Lakewood. And I could feel as I continued to mature as a police officer, my reasons for being there changed. I started off as a beat patrolman, and from there to a sergeant, a supervisor, supervising men and women in the field, and then as a lieutenant in a watch commander role where you're responsible for an entire patrol division, much of it in the midnight hours. So I was the highest ranking person on the department. My wife remarked that for our first 10 years of our marriage, much of it was spent with me working evenings and midnights. And then later on as a captain, broader responsibility and looking more at the entire community and how we could best serve the law enforcement needs of an entire community instead of being focused on a beat and a small portion. And then as the police chief, certainly getting involved in the community and looking at the needs of the entire community and getting the police involved in a community policing culture. Tried to bring that into Naperville when I came. And
David, I'm going to interrupt a little bit,
sure,
with your permission. One of the common themes that does pop up in the topics that we are addressing under collaborative policing and the sensitivity with which the police are expected to deal with their constituents. So I want to take you back again. So bear with me. We will come back to the present, but
that's okay.
I am fascinated with this aspect. You've heard me talk about this over the last 2-3 decades about ideally law enforcement being a partnership between the officials who undertake the law enforcement and the constituents that they are serving. And you have, in your introduction, talked about serving the community already 2-3 times. So help me understand, when you started out as a patrolman, if you're able to think back to some of that time and the first few years of your service on the Lakewood Police Department back in Colorado, what was the understanding? So a patrolman comes in, the police were there to do what? Serve the community, protect them, or enforce the laws? Help me understand, but I'm trying to try to put yourself into that frame of mind, sure, and that will bring you into the future.
Sure. I mean, much of what police were involved in at that point in time was the enforcement of the law. But I learned early on that I could not enforce the law by myself. If I wanted to interview somebody about a crime, they had to trust me. And if we did not develop that trust with the members we served, then they wouldn't cooperate with the police and we couldn't enforce the law. When you're investigating a crime, you've got to have that community trust. And so I actually learned that early on. And then when I was an assistant police chief, I went to the FBI National Academy. And this would have been in the 80s. And for the very first time, I heard the words community-oriented policing and developing these partnerships. And I said, this is really, in some ways, I thought to myself, the term community-oriented policing, if you're not policing your community, what are you doing? It's like saying an instructor is a student-oriented instructor. Well, of course you're a student-oriented instructor. You're a teacher. And if you're not policing your community, you're not community-oriented, then what are you doing out there?
But David, hang on there.
I came back.
David, my apologies again if I interrupt. You are hitting
okay.
up on a very key point, and I have a feeling you'll agree with me. Your expression of community-oriented policing and the analogy to a professor or a teacher with a student-oriented approach, that seems intuitive to you, and I can tell you it's intuitive to me. But clearly, there is a demarcation between that what we assume to be a basic understanding and what seems to be prevalent out there. So you're both now in your most recent professional life, you've been a teacher, you've been a professor, and
yes.
I've had the privilege of coming in and speaking at some of your classes. But let's talk a little bit about that. So when you speak about student-oriented teaching, the focus is not on what you want to teach. The focus is on what is relevant to the students and how you do have a curriculum, of course, but you present it in a way that is appealing to the students, addresses their concerns, and does it with sensitivity, candor, and building their trust. You with me so far, right? No disagreement.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. So and the same thing goes with police.
There you go. There you go.
Yeah.
Why? Now let's start building upon what you said as your introductory aspects. So there was clearly something different about your approach to policing when you joined, where you were receptive immediately to say, hey, I've got to do these things. I have to build the trust with the people that I am helping enforce the laws with. And I have to have my understanding about who I am serving, right? And my demeanor has to be tailored to that. So tell me a little bit about that and then bring it forward. What's so difficult with the majority of, or am I misreading the situation?
Sure. Some of that, Kareem, goes all the way back to my childhood and my upbringing with my parents teaching me to trust and to respect others and treat them with respect and dignity. So I tried to do that with other people, and it held over into my adult life, and it's I think absolutely critical. Now, police get involved in situations where, of course, they're going to meet people who are evil from time to time. You're going to meet those in your career. You're going to meet people who mistreat others and who are not cooperative. But by and large, most people really are good people. And the same thing holds true with police officers. The optics aside, from what I've seen recently, most of the police officers I have met in my career have been some of the most courageous and considerate people that I've met in any profession, and they really want to do a good job. Now, I've met bad cops in my career, but I've met a lot of good ones too. And nobody likes a bad cop or dislikes a bad cop more than another cop. When we see something that you've seen on television with some of the videos of police officers engaged in brutal tactics that are simply unprofessional and criminal in nature, they need to get out of the profession. and that's the best way to handle them, but hold them accountable. But much of my own background came from my upbringing and the way I treat people. And then when I became a police chief, I found, quite frankly, a very receptive community to work with the police. When I first met you, our very first meeting, I can recall Tom Kinnear, the head of the Chicago office of the FBI, brought us together, if you recall. And I mean, I thought, Mr. Irfan is a very open person, and I think one of the first things I did was invite you to the Citizen Police Academy. Sure. And you came in and learned about policing, and then you invited me to some Islamic functions. And next thing I knew, I was learning a whole new culture that I didn't know anything about. So I think maybe we both did. You learned about police, and I learned about you. So,
the part that I want us to spend a little bit of time, Chief Dial, is on the cultural aspects of it. So allow me to steer the conversation toward what we would, in our business terminology, call the human resources aspect, the HR
Sure.
aspect. So you come in as a rookie back in Lakewood, and you had the upbringing you spoke about. You had the concern, the compassion, the values of serving. Sure. So that tells me, when I look at it from the business management perspective, okay, there are going to be certain characteristics that are essential in this profession. When we hire, say, somebody to be a financial analyst, yes, there is the technical skill set, but we would say, in addition, you need to have something beyond that suits you to that particular role. So tell me if there is some validity to, should there be a threshold of characteristics that should somehow be emphasized when we are seeking people to get into the law enforcement role? Should it be made clear, if Kareem Irfan is applying to be a rookie police officer, I should know, hey, I'm going into a profession where I'm expected to be, quote unquote, in the service of the community. I'm expected to develop trust. I'm expected to have caring compassion that is expressed and understood. Do you see where I'm heading there? I'm sure it is done, but speak a little bit about it, please, David.
There's tremendous effort to get the right people into police departments. When you become a police officer, you of course end up taking a written exam and an oral interview and a background investigation, and you undergo a psychological investigation, and not everybody is cut out for policing, and they do hire from the human race. And so once in a while, they're going to make some mistakes. I mean, it's going to happen. Or sometimes people change when they get into the profession for one reason or another. Personal things will happen, and they will change. If people become cynical, and I try to talk to young police officers about this, when you going through your career, be careful that you don't fall into a police cultural thing where you start to believe we're cops and you're not. And I try to have some other interests. You had other friends before you became a cop. Keep them. And they're important. And it's important for you to have outside interests. I mean, I was a cop through and through, but I always had other people outside of the department that I stayed with and communicated with, and it has helped me tremendously throughout my career to be involved with other people.
Super.
And people.
One interjection. As you speak about that, also speak about the need for addressing understanding the community that you in fact are policing for. There must have been changes, right? The constituents that you served back in Colorado were much different than when you came to Naperville. And I bet you'll agree with me that over the last 10 years, the constituency has changed. The diversity has rapidly expanded. The faiths that are represented, the sensitivities that you folks need to take into account has changed. How much of a burden should it be on the police officers and the leadership to make sure that everybody understands who they are expected to be engaging?
I think it's absolutely the responsibility of the leader of policing to get involved in the community, to understand the community, and if there are changes going on, to understand what those changes are and what the people need. If you don't understand the community, you can't police the community. Yet a big part of understanding, like communication, is listening. Listen to what others are saying. Sometimes I think the human brain is almost geared between right and wrong, and black and white, and it's not. It's gray. And when somebody challenges our position or says something different, we tend to tense up and go the opposite way. And instead of moving toward the middle and compromise and understanding, we end up further and further apart. I believe that's the number one challenge to security in America today, on a broad perspective, is the extreme partisanship that we have, and the lack of cooperation between politicians, and trying to pass legislation that is needed for our communities. And it just seems that if one side wants one thing, the other side doesn't want it, regardless of how good it may be for society. And so as a consequence, they don't get anything done. Well, the same thing can happen on a micro scale, and police in the community try to understand what those needs are, and then you can serve them better.
Wonderful. I think we are getting closer to the focus of our discussion today. Having set the need to make sure there is a culture that is described for the policing arena, a culture for law enforcement, and the need to define a set of characteristics that are essential somehow beyond what are the quote unquote technical skill sets that are needed, and then the need for the leadership to define the understanding with which the recruits, all of the police officers, all of the law enforcement officers approach their assignments, which is in the service and in the enforcement of laws with the community that they engage. Okay, let's acknowledge that. Now, whether or not that is done, how it can be improved, yes, there are improvements to be done. We will save that for another discussion, David. For today, let's bring it up a little bit to the time that you moved to Naperville. I know you have related this, and it's been published, your conversation with somebody on your force at that time who said, hey, you will like what happens here. You're going to be here forever. Remember that discussion?
I do. I recall that.
There you go. Tell us a little bit about that, because the longevity that you have had in your experiences and the effectiveness are somehow tied together. Speak a little bit about that.
Yeah. Let me just say, I didn't realize how quickly forever would come. I thought it was a long way away, but it does pass. When I came in, I found a community that was an established community with extreme volunteerism among the people in the community, and an openness. And they had me speaking at different functions. I'd speak at the Kiwanis, at the Rotary, speak before the religious communities, and many speaking engagements to talk to people about the community and what was going on in it. And I found myself welcomed, and I took advantage of it. I mean, I came in and took advantage of those opportunities to get to meet with people. And I mean, the quality of life in this community is important to me. I had my family here, and I want a good quality of life for them, just as everybody does. And pretty much everybody wants the same thing. High crime areas, the people who dislike it more than anybody else are the victims who have to live around it. I mean, none of us like to see an area where children are killed or anything else, or any other types of murders, but the people who dislike it the most are the ones who have to live there in fear constantly. So that's what you got to listen to and try to connect with. Hey,
speak about that last sentence you said, because that was one of the points I had written down for our discussions, Chief Dial, and that is when you said when you have areas where things are bad, high crime, murders, and the like, the people living there are perhaps the most affected and most concerned. Talk about that, because we tend to forget about that. And I'll tell you why. We live in Naperville. Yes, it's a wonderful community, and I've seen similar communities around. And we just say, oh, that's that particular area. Yes, the crime is growing there. That's rough, man. That's difficult. Let's watch out.
Yeah.
We rarely do we focus on those people who are living there. So speak about that from your
that is absolutely where the focus needs to be, is on the people who live in those communities and have the needs. There's a symbiotic relationship between the police and the community. The police need the community, and the community need the police. And the police cannot do it all. I want you to think of an analogy here of your health and your doctor. Your doctor can do a lot of things to make you healthy. He can prescribe medicine. He can perform surgery. He can do things to make you healthy, but he can't do it all. He can't change your heredity. He can't change your age. He can't change what you put into your system. And if you put drugs that are harmful into your system, he can't do that. You have to not do that. Well, the same is true with the police department. They can do a lot to control crime and improve the quality of life, but they cannot do it all without the community support. And that's where the partnership and the cooperation, collaboration comes in. If they have that, you will have a safe community with a quality of life. However, if you don't have that cooperation and it's built off of trust, if you show me a community that does not trust the police, I will show you a community with high crime. And it's all across America. If you don't have the trust and the cooperation, you got the crime.
You got me right on to the next segue there, the element of trust. Let's talk about that. And before we jump off my previous question, David, let's say there is a community. We are speaking about when you came in. The Aurora area was changing at that point in time. It evolved. There were some developments with respect to rampant crime and shoplifting and burglaries and then drug abuse, all of that. What did you in fact advise your patrolmen and officers who are assigned to that area in terms of understanding the needs and concerns and sensitivities of people in that area, and then talk about how that helped build trust?
Quite simply, when you're working those areas, you have to get out of your car once in a while and talk to people, not in an enforcement mode. A lot of times people don't have contacts with police officers unless something's wrong. They're either being stopped, they have called a police officer, somebody is hurt, they need something. No one ever calls the police to say, I'm having a really great day today, officer, and I just wanted you to know it. There's always something wrong. Well, and you can get into a shell inside a police car. You can put your dark sunglasses on and your windows up and your air conditioner and never see the public, and they don't see you. You have to get out once in a while and talk to people and find out what is going on. And then when something does happen, they'll say, I remember that officer, and I trust that officer. And you can do it in a variety of ways. It can be in homeowner association meetings. It can be in groups. I have talked to people just standing on a corner and met them. And how you doing today? What's going on? And just creating a relationship.
But David, hang on. I'm going to push back a little bit. All of those are
okay.
Sentiments. They make sense coming from a person like Chief Dial. I understand that. How does the chief make sure that there is a requirement that, let's say he has 100 officers, that they actually get into the mode of doing these things, what are, again, bear with me if I fall back onto my business management or business strategy approach, what are the key performance indicators, as we call it? How do you reflect and measure this culture that you're trying to define? How did you manage that at the Naperville Police Department?
It starts with selection, getting the right people in the job, and then training them, supervision, explaining to the supervisors what you want, and having strong supervisors, and holding people accountable, and recognizing good police work when you see it, and giving recognition to those officers who do well. And if they're not doing well, be honest about it. Don't be open communications with the community, with the officers, and the media. And when you hear the word transparency, well, it's important, and let them know how you feel. Most people want to be recognized for doing something well, and they will listen to their leader. If their leader will explain what they want, then it will come through. But if they don't talk about it and they don't work on it, it takes constant work. It's not easy. It's not going to be something I can say at one time and we're done talking about it. It's going to take constant communication.
Wonderful. I'm going to push a little bit deeper, if you will allow me. What comes to my mind is in some of my international work in this collaborative policing area, David, there was a conversation that I had with the mayor of Amsterdam as we were talking about how do we help understand better. At that time, their concern was the Muslim communities that they were policing and the possibility of radicalism. And then how do you just engender trust? And one of the aspects that I had brought up there was how do you ensure that if the policemen or policewomen who are assigned to that area, they are actually doing concrete actions that you define for them in terms of visiting the communities, engaging and talking to them, building trust, and then documenting and reporting and following up on that. Because one of the mantras that we live by in the business world, David, is what you cannot measure, you cannot change. So that's why I'm thinking a little bit. What did you do in Naperville? You speak about let's say there is this area of Aurora which is of concern, and you've got 10 policemen that are assigned to that area. How did you make sure they actually were, as you said, not sitting in their cars, going there, doing something before they were required to engage as a policeman?
We actually made that part of their annual evaluations. Police officers are evaluated annually. Okay. And we engaged in what we call problem-oriented policing. And we asked the beat officers to identify problems and the solutions to those problems. And then during the next year, work on that particular problem, whatever it may be. The problem is the people here don't trust the police, and there's drugs being sold in the area, and I can't seem to get into finding out who the drug dealers are, and because they won't communicate with me, then there's your problem. Now go about solving it. The next year I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, and tell them what you're going to do, and then document that. If it's not documented, it didn't happen. I mean, you've got to put it in writing, and you've got to put what your goals are. And if something doesn't work, I mean, you may come up with an idea that failed. My idea to do this didn't work. Okay, what's next?
Sure.
You're not going to do the same thing twice.
One last point in that regard. One last point. So would it make sense, and perhaps this has been done, but I wanted to just tease that out a little bit. If I'm a person working with you as a police officer or somebody with a higher degree of authority, that I am expected, in addition to the problem-oriented policing that you spoke about, in addition, I'm expected to present to you what I have been doing to actually build trust, actually connect with people in the community. What have I done on a weekly basis? or on a monthly
Mhm.
basis.
Mhm.
I'm not talking about the core policing aspects. That's not an issue. We know that is not an issue in general across the country too. It's a matter of the relationships part of it, the engendering the trust, the communications and transparency part of it. So should there be something that is defined and measured there, David?
Yeah, yes, there is. And let me talk about this for just a minute. The building the trust, you have a leader or a chief of police or somebody. It goes beyond that. It's got to get down to that line level officer. I can go and I can give the best speech possible to, well, I could maybe a pretty good speech to a community group, and a cop can go out and spoil that relationship that I've tried to create in
Bingo.
10
Bingo.
seconds. And
Yep.
so they have to get involved in it. When the 9/11 attacks occurred, they were shocking to everybody. And I didn't quite know exactly the best way to start to police it. But I did talk with leaders in the department, and we said, well, if we have Islamic radicals, we're going to have two groups that are going to need to see police. And that was the synagogues and the mosque. At that time, we had one mosque. Let's go by and show them a police action in both areas. And at that time, I did not personally know a single Muslim leader in the community, and didn't until I met you. Yeah, and it not because I didn't want to. It's just that it flew under my radar. I didn't see anything going on, and then I met you, and I said, wow, we got a whole bunch of people here, and I better learn about this. And then it just worked out very well for us. And then I think I know that your members started to see, when you opened a second mosque, you started to see police cars and developing a relationship. Not because you called them, because they drove through to check to be sure that everything's okay. And when you had a series of burglaries inside of a mosque and contacted me, and the question was, what can we do? I knew what the detectives were going to say. I did not know how the Muslim community would react. But so I brought a couple of detectives up, and I said, here's the problem. They're having these burglaries. There's no evidence of entry. They know money is being taken. What do you guys suggest? And they said, we want to put cameras inside the mosque. We promise you we will not turn them on until after prayer services end. And we'll watch them throughout the nighttime. And they said, yes. And that resulted in what became the very first night that came. There was a burglary, and we saw people at a time. We apprehended them. A short period of time. It was 3 days. Later, we had burglars, and then when I was contacted, who knows more about somebody spreading radical thoughts than members of the Islamic community? You're not going to come to me and tell me about. I mean, the radicals not. But when we had the person coming to Naperville, they came to us and they told us, and I don't know if you remember that or not, but it resulted in very quickly some action by the police, and the person ended up moving to Florida, where he later tried to buy a bomb, and he's now in prison for the rest of his life because he was going to blow up. He did buy a bomb, but it was inert, came from an undercover FBI agent.
Sure.
But
what I'm reminded,
nobody will know.
David, what I'm reminded of here is the sensitivity, again, with which you had built up the trust. Going back to the time when you were thinking of increasing the patrolling around the mosque in the post 9/11 arena for time frame.
Sure.
For instance, you were smart enough, you were sensitive enough to realize, even though this was an act of quote unquote goodness from your behalf, but it could potentially be seen as a sense of potential harassment, of increased patrolling. So you reached out to us. And we had the
Yeah.
conversation, and before the cars came, we could tell the community, look, the police is interested in helping us out, working with us. So we welcomed you with open arms. So the reason I bring that up is that sense of thinking about the other side, thinking about the stakeholders, who they are and what are their needs, what are their sensitivities is an important element. So keeping that in mind, David, I know we will be running short of time. My goodness, there is so much to be talking about, but I want to bring us to this focus that is going on around the country on the defunding, whatever that means, and whether it is reallocation of resources or reduction of the police force. Let's talk about a little bit of that. And in the time frame, I'm just giving you the heads up. I do want to address this concept of this concern with the inability of police chiefs or the people they report up to in enforcing defined standards which are violated. I mean, when police are. So let's keep the role of unions to come into the place. So today, I do want to make sure in the time we have, we address those. Talk a little bit from your understanding about what you think is going on with defunding and what are your perspectives.
Let me kind of cover a couple of things here, and I will get to defunding.
Sure.
I know that there's I believe an irrational hysteria going on nationally, and there's political pandering to anarchists. But I still believe that most members of the community support their police. And I know it can be demoralizing for the police to hear this, and they start to worry about their jobs. But I think by and large, the people do support their police. And I understand radical thinking and subversive thinking. I understand people who would challenge orderly, civilized communities to exist. But I simply do not understand politicians who are complicit in the effort to undermine the rule of law, and they ignore sedition in this country. And when you let people take over, you tell your police departments, do not enforce the rule of law. I got it. You protest is absolutely American, and people can protest and express their opinions and express them at the polls. But when they start burning down buildings and murdering people, and police officers can't go into communities where they had murders, as in Seattle, I think that's absurd. I just think it's absolutely irrational, and I don't understand it at all. The police officers need political support, and they've got to have it in order to be effective. Now, let's talk about defunding. I think there's too much emphasis on police and maybe not enough on everybody's part on about the issues going on. I think they ought to bring in other partners into this and talk about health, education, parks, recreation, housing, job training, and infrastructure in communities, and attack this problem on a broad basis rather than focusing so narrowly on the police. And I don't think the funding ought to be directed so much at the police as it is the broad funding sources that are necessary to improve the quality of life in the communities. Am I a fan of defunding or doing away with the police? No. No, I support the police, and I do not support bad cops. Don't get me wrong here. I worked for 45 years in that career. I told you I met some really tremendous people. I also saw bad cops as a police chief, as an assistant chief. I have disciplined and I have terminated people who did not deserve to wear that badge. So, but by and large, it does not mean that you ought to give up on the overwhelming majority of them who are out every day doing a job that most people don't want to do, and trying to serve their communities and putting their lives on the line and going home. And trust me, there's nobody who dislikes one of these videos on TV more than a good cop. You
Well,
think you don't like them? I'm telling you, I hate to see them. And
I think you have summarized that very well, Chief.
yeah,
While the reason I wanted to address that term is, in my personal opinion, that is a term which is so misunderstood and misused, defunding. I think it'll be ideal if it were up to me to just take it out of the discourse, but focus on what is involved with this concept of collaborative policing, where we look at the police as sharing the responsibilities with the stakeholders that they are going to be serving, so that you look at the responsibilities being shared, resources being shared, and decision making also to be shared, because this is a collaboration that necessarily has to be addressed in a multi-sector approach, right? You have to look at the public aspects of it,
I think so,
aspects, and the community aspects. So we have to make sure we bring them together. So in the time that we have left, you did address a little bit of it, David, but talk about the fact that we need, when we speak about policing, there are so many other aspects to it that they cover. The public health aspect, the mental health aspect. You said parks and recreation, of course. The probation aspects. How does the workplace get developed? What is the role of faith-based organizations? All of these are part of the broader concept of policing, right? So somehow they have to be engaged, and then we have to define the problem together. We have to come up with a solution together, and then we have to implement the solution together. What do you think about that? I know it's a mouthful, but I wanted to squeeze that in before we ran.
The whole term collaboration implies working together. And if we can't work together, we are not going to have the quality of life that we deserve in our communities. This is a tremendous country. It's got a lot of really bright people in all kinds of positions. And all they need to do is to get together and resolve some of these issues. Immigration is one that just absolutely, and I bring that up because I think it's a great example. Both sides of the aisle will suggest that that immigration needs to be reformed. The second president, George Bush, wanted to reform it, and then he got tied up as the war president. Obama wanted to reform it, and he didn't get it done. And so now we have, actually the Senate got together and they did pass a bill. They passed the Senate bill, I believe it was 213, I'm not sure of the exact number, but they had called the Gang of Eight. 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans worked together. They passed a bill that enabled a path to citizenship, greater border security, and it didn't get past the House. And so we got nothing done because somebody wouldn't work out the disagreements in it. I think if you talk to almost any of them, they'll all say, yes, we need border reform or we need immigration reform. Well, sit down and do it. You guys are bright. Let's make this thing happen. And I think it hurts our country because we've just gone on now. We're going into decade after decade. Last immigration reform bill came from Ronald Reagan. That was a long time ago.
Sure. One last thing, David. We still have just about 5 minutes or so left. Let's talk about the enforcement of established guidelines and principles. So let's say there is a set, we don't have to say, let's say there are defined performance expectations with respect to behavior toward those being policed, brutality, what is appropriate force, all of that. Let's leave the ambiguous parts of it aside, but assuming that those have been violated, there are concerns that are legitimately expressed, I believe, to some degree, about the lack of long-term enforceability because there are too many protections on the side of those who are violating those guidelines. What do you have to say and help us understand in that regard?
Police officers do have a lot of job stability. They've got a police officer bill of rights in every state in America. It has been strengthened over the years. There was a point when you had a break between administrative interviews and criminal interviews. And the administrative issues were for violations of department policy, which you could be terminated on. A criminal interview is one in which you could be arrested. You don't necessarily have to commit a crime to be terminated. I mean, if you violate a department policy, that's not a criminal act. Can you be terminated? If it's a serious policy, the answer is yes, and it's administrative in nature. But now what's happened is the laws have changed, and they have the possibility of engaging in behavior where you need to talk to somebody, and you can't do it because they have a certain amount of time before they have to be interviewed by a supervisor or an internal affairs officer of some sort. So it can delay internal affairs investigations. And it's one of those laws I heard once in a cop show, and a cop say, I hate that law. Well, some of these laws I don't think are the best for maintaining integrity in a police department. I think they can drag out the process. And when I see some situations where in some departments they go on for months or even years, I just say, why? There's no need for that. There is no need for a police involved shooting is a serious thing, and it should be investigated quickly from an administrative standpoint. If there's something wrong with it, if the force is wrong, it should be presented to the prosecuting attorney, and a decision should be made on prosecuting the officer. And that should not have a specific bearing on the administrative part. Just because a prosecutor says that, well, there's not enough cause here, or we don't think we can, that does not mean that he did not violate a use of force policy, which you can still take administrative discipline on, up to and including termination. And you don't have to let him have 10 complaints built up for excessive force before you do something, or before he kills somebody.
Fascinating.
That's my thoughts.
That's well put. David, there is so much that we could continue to talk about, but at least today, I would like to make sure that you and I depart from this episode with a shared understanding. So allow me to summarize, and then I'll let you put in your closing statement. I think we are agreeing that under current circumstances, a serious assessment of the situation is warranted, that we have to be prepared to identify changes that are needed and to work together from this perspective of collaborative policing, with the understanding that we have to have the concerns of the stakeholders, the diversity of stakeholders engaged, and then that there is a common drive towards sharing of responsibilities, resources, and decision-making of the entirety of stakeholders, including the police, and that we have to focus on some key characteristics which are particularly desirable in the police force, the engendering of trust with the communities that we are expected to be serving, while keeping a focus on the difficulties of the job and recognizing and appreciating the vast majority of the police who are so committed and dedicated, and also being focused on weeding out those who tend to poison the well, just the small minority of those who are not doing their job, who have got incorrect intentions and all of that. But the bottom line being, changes are warranted in view of what we are seeing around the country, and we just need to have sane and mature voices and leadership coming in to define the right culture and the right element of serving the community and protecting the security of our society, but doing so in a collaborative manner. Your turn, my friend, in closing this out.
You wrapped it up pretty well. I would add add the word holistic change, not just focusing on law enforcement, education, health, the infrastructure, welfare in the community, and family issues. I mean, a lot of things happen that start at home. And they really do need to think about family responsibilities and things like that. So we don't have ongoing violent crimes that are committed in neighborhoods.
Fantastic. Chief Dial, absolute delight to have you with us. And I could not have asked for a more mature, more sensitive, more informed, and more understanding guest to launch our Understanding Today show.
Wow.
I'm sure we will have to continue our discussion at another upcoming episode. Thank you much for being here. And for all of our viewers, we hope that you will enjoy this inaugural episode. Do provide us with your input on specific topics you want us to address, specific guests to be brought aboard. The goal here is, as we spoke about collaborative policing, I want this to be a collaborative, informative, and entertaining exchange for us. I want to thank our producers, Sadiq Abdullah, Miriam Tisdale, and of course, Muslim Network TV for hosting us. Thank you so much for watching, and come back and join us for the next episode. Thank you, folks. Kareem Irfan signing off. Assalamu alaikum. Greetings of peace to all.
Thank you very